Hello and welcome to Serial Killers. Today we're talking about the life and death of John Wayne Gacey Jr., a prolific serial killer who murdered at least 33 young men and boys between 1972 and 1978. Gacey was born in Chicago, Illinois on March 17, 1942. He had a difficult childhood marked by abuse and neglect. His father, John Stanley Gacey, was an alcoholic and abusive man. Gacey's mother, Marion Elaine Robinson, tried to protect her son from his father's abuse, but she was often unsuccessful. Gacey was also bullied by his peers. He was overweight and unathletic, and he was also teased for being different. Gacey's father would also compare him unfavorably to his two sisters, telling him that he was sissy and a mama's boy. Gacey's father's abuse had a profound impact on him. He developed a deep-seated inferiority complex and a hatred of his own sexuality. He also became adept at lying and manipulating others in order to survive. Gacey began engaging in criminal activity at a young age. In 1958, he was arrested for indecent exposure. In 1964, he was arrested for public lewdness. In 1966, Gacey was arrested for sexually assaulting a 15-year-old boy. He was sentenced to prison, but he was released on parole in 1970. While in prison, Gacey underwent psychological evaluation. He was diagnosed with antisocial personality. This personality disorder is characterized by the lack of empathy and remorse for others. Gacey was also found to be a sexual sadist, meaning that he derived pleasure from inflicting pain and suffering on others. After his release from prison, Gacey moved back to Chicago and started contracting businesses. He also became involved in politics and served as a Democratic precinct captain. Gacey used his business and political contacts to gain access to young men and boys. He would lure his victims to his home with the promise of jobs, money, or sex. Once his victims were inside his house, Gacey would handcuff them, beat them, and strangle them to death. He would then bury his victims in the crawl space under his house. Gacey was able to get away with his crimes for many years because he was a skilled manipulator and a con artist. He was able to convince the people around him that he was a normal and outstanding citizen. He was also able to use his business and political connections to evade suspicion. Gacey's luck ran out in 1978 when police began investigating the disappearance of Robert Pease, a 17-year-old boy. Pease had been seen lastly going to Gacey's home for a job interview. Police searched Gacey's home and found the bodies of 26 of his victims buried in the crawl space. They also found evidence of Gacey's sexual sadism, including handcuffs, whips, and other torture devices. Gacey was arrested and charged with 33 counts of murder. He was convicted of all counts in 1980 and sentenced to death. Gacey spent 14 years on death row. He was executed by lethal injection on May 10, 1994. Gacey's execution was a fitting end for a man who had committed such heinous crimes. However, his story is also a cautionary tale about the dangers of abuse and neglect. Gacey's childhood trauma played a major role in his development into a serial killer. Gacey's crimes had a devastating impact on his victims and their families. Many of his victims were young men and boys who were just starting out in life. Their families were left to pick up the pieces after the senseless murders. Gacey's crimes also had a negative impact on the community of Chicago. People were scared and distrustful of one another. John Wayne Gacey Jr. was a monster who preyed on the innocent and took their lives. His crimes were horrific and shocking. His execution was a fitting end for a man who committed such heinous crimes. Gacey's story is also a cautionary tale about the dangers of abuse and neglect. His childhood trauma played a major role in his development into a serial killer. In our next episode, I'm going to talk about the life and death of another notorious serial killer, Ted Bundy. Bundy was a charismatic and intelligent man who was able to charm his victims and get away with his crimes for many years. He murdered at least 30 young women and girls in the 1970s. Bundy's story is a fascinating and disturbing one. I encourage you to join me for our next episodes to learn more about Ted Bundy and the impact of his crimes. I am Ricardo Islas. Thank you for watching Serial Killers.